Boards, games, boards, games, and area movements. It's what we're talking about. Boards, games, and area movements. I'm not gonna shout. Here we are. It's been quite a while, but there's Nikita who always makes me smile, and we are going to have a lovely chat about the ways that things can be put on a map and you can move your pieces around. Area movements, today's subject to be found. We'll talk about this in various ways. We won't go on too long, it will not be 4 days. Board games and area movements, it's what we're talking about. Area movements, and I'm not gonna shout. Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good whatever it is, wherever you are. It's time for Bessie Beats and Board Game Bladder, episode 755, Pondering Mechanisms, Area Movement, featuring Nikita Sullivan. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
And yes, I reached out, and it's been so long. I think it was like episode, when I did a quick search, it was episode 380. It's like, must be over a year ago that we properly chatted. But we have had some lovely chats. I saw you saying on Twitter that this is the first time we've been on a stream since we actually met at UK Games Expo. We actually properly met in person, which is lovely. And hello, Xate. It is lovely to have you here. And I chat about, because with Alan Paul, we've been going through all these things, and we've talked about acting, action drafting, action points, action queue, action retrieval, action timer, action event, advantage token, alliances, area majority influence, and now finally, well, not finally at all, we're still in the A's. We're talking about area movements. I just want to acknowledge that this is very different. This is like the past one, area majority influence, was where it started to diverge a little bit from this book. Here, it's totally different. We'll get into that a wee bit later. And Nikita, do you have anything burning that you want to say about area movement, or about who you are, for people who've never seen you before?
Hi everyone, I'm Nikita from Attican Games. If you've not seen me before, I make games and I handcraft gaming accessories as well. The reason I wanted to do area movement is because it's one that I've actually put in a game recently, so I thought I might have something to say about it, but who really knows? Looking through a lot of the area movement games, I haven't played many of them, so that's not useful, but we'll see how it goes.
And I think it's always nice to have a variety of opinions, even if you haven't played everything. Hopefully everything's understandable enough that, you've got a sense of what it is. And I think this is an interesting one, where it's more about the presentation of the things rather than actually what you're able to do. Because, but let's get to that in a couple of minutes. First of all, maybe we could talk about recent highlights, living life and seeing the sights, recent highlights, playing games and other delights, recent highlights. What are some of your recent highlights? What have you been up to in the past couple of days or whatever?
So I've been getting organised, which is nice. Sadly, a month or two ago, I had to postpone my next Kickstarter. So instead, I've been focusing on getting everything really nicely organised, making sure I've got everything ready for Christmas sales and stuff like that. I got my first sale on my website yesterday, which is really nice, because so far it's been all Etsy and GameFound. So someone actually found me and bought something from me, which is amazing. And my cat's been unwell, but he's eating again. And that's a massive highlight for me, because if you've ever had a pet that stops eating, it's really scary. But he's eating again, and he's the cuddliest he's ever been as well. He's constantly wants to be on my lap. So we've been having lots of cuddles.
Well, that sounds lovely. And, it can be so scary, yes, when you're like, oh, this change in behavior is this way. But remember that even though bits of us generally don't tend to grow back, like, some of us does, like hair and fingernails, but most of us doesn't. But we are quite resilient in some ways. Like the amount that we need to eat or drink is maybe less than we think. And, we are able to come back and be fighting strong, hopefully.
Yeah, well, for him, it's kidney disease, and cats do stop eating to the point where they stop.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it's a really weird thing with cats where, sorry, this is supposed to be highlights, but it's a really weird thing with cats.
It's a recent event.
When they get renal disease, they can just reach a point where they won't eat. So the vet gave him some pills that increase his appetite. So now he's eating. So that's good.
Well, I'm happy that modern medicine and drugs exist to do things that need to be done, like increasing appetites, or indeed, vaccines. I think that I could quickly talk about what I've been up to. I've not been up to anything super exciting the last day. I'm just going to move it on to brilliant things. Brilliant things. What's a little thing which is brilliant? I mean, modern medicine, you talked about it yourself, these drugs to increase the appetite. I mean, to make sure that not only humans, but also our animal companions can be kept safe and healthy and alive. And vaccines and, extra,
For instance, I now have a blood sugar monitor.
Hooray!
So I don't have to prick my finger like 50 times a day. I just got a little reader that reads it and tells me what's going on.
And so I think that we can all agree, modern medicine, it's brilliant. And like the science, it keeps evolving. I was trying to think of the word nutrients. That's the one I was thinking of, nutrients and vitamins and all those kinds of things. So yeah, all of those are brilliant. Do we want to say anything else about that, or shall we just get to the main topic?
No, I'm happy with that. That is a brilliant thing.
Okay, excellent. So at this point, as always, remember to feel free to comment, ask questions, follow. And today we are talking about area movement. Now, area movement, it's similar to point-to-point movement. Point-to-point, you've got places and you've got little points, and then you're moving along a line, kind of like en route, or Friedrich, which is this little picture. When they're tessellated nicely, when it's a regular grid, like chess, or hexagons, then it's grid movement. And when it's, well, here's the thing. I think that even though Board Game Geek says repeating or non-repeating, regular or irregularly spaced areas, really the grid movement, that covers grid movements as well, but that is in its own space in grid movement. And so I think that really what we're going to focus on today is the irregular tessellation. And would you mind if I read a little bit from this book by Geoff Engelstein and Isaac Shalev, and maybe we can compare it to the way that it's presented on Board Game Geek, because this is where things diverge massively.
Yeah, sounds good.
Okay, so here, all of these things, grid movement, point-to-point, track movement, it's all in one category, and it says tessellation. The playing field is divided into spaces to regulate movement. That's literally all it says. And so that is a tiny bit that then encompasses grids, and you can see later at the end of it talks about tracks and squares and hexagons and three-dimensional things and all the different bits. It talks about, yes, first, irregular patterns are called area maps. There are several design considerations. If they regulate movement, the areas should be approximately the same size, or at least movements equivalent. For example, a mountainous region may be divided into smaller, more numerous spaces, so it takes more moves to traverse. And I think this is a really interesting thing, where the sizes of the areas, the smaller they are, the more difficult it is to go past it, and you can get a bit of flavor that way. If possible, regions should not touch at a corner, and they should only touch at an edge, which is also a really interesting thing, because if you've got things touching at a corner, then you've inherently got the question, well, do corners count? Do they not? Whereas if you've got a brickwork thing, then you don't have to answer that question, which is really nice. And I think this is really interesting, how you can not even have that question ever be a possibility just by good graphic design. And it does point out area maps are isomorphic to point-to-point movement, where boxes or circles are connected by lines. Sometimes point-to-point maps can be preferable as they clearly show connections, and connection information like rivers or borders may be more evident. Point-to-point maps are also common in space games where the connection between two stars is shown. And I think this is a really interesting thing where, as we've said, point-to-point area, it's kind of the same thing. And what do you think of that? And hello, Josie, it is lovely to see you. Do you have a preference between area movement and point-to-point movement? Because it seems to be basically just a visual separation.
Yeah, I think it is just the visual, really. And I think that's probably just based on the design. If it makes sense for these areas to be further away from each other, then point-to-point makes sense. Whereas if you're traversing a map like in Risk, or like you said, Risk has point-to-point and area movement. So it just kind of makes sense. Like Pandemic, you have a bit of exactly the same, don't you? So you're moving across areas. And yeah, so on that map, it makes sense for it to be point-to-point from...
across the sea from like...
across the sea makes sense.
The Greenland or...
Yeah, I think it really just depends on your design and what works best for that area and that game.
It feels like inherently point-to-point is kind of wasting a lot of the board visually, because then you've got to draw lines where it could have just been a bigger area to have more spaces for cubes or whatever. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I guess on this, though, you couldn't just have them attached, so they kind of need to be point-to-point if it's over the sea.
Yeah, I mean, then it would be... Well,
I don't think I've played a point-to-point game where it wasn't basically a map going over the sea. So there might be some where it just really doesn't make sense.
Yeah, I mean, interestingly, if I think I've got Star Wars Rebellion here, and even though in the book it's specifically called out stars, where it could be point-to-point, but they've decided, hey, let's have these borders, because for whatever reason they've decided that this is going to be an easier way to represent it visually than having lots of lines going from one to another.
Yeah, so I haven't played it, but looking at it, it looks visually nicer that they've got bounding boxes rather than 4 or 5 lines coming off of a given star or planet.
Because it can be quite confusing, right? And that looking at whoops, that's maybe zoomed in a bit too much, but on the bottom corner where there's a tiny sliver of a connection with the one on the bottom left and this one on the blue planet. And I think that just being able to go around and see what's connected is probably visually easier than having to follow lots of lines and then keep them in your memory. And because there is the planet just above and to the right, which visually is equally close as the one on the bottom left. And yeah,
it looks like on given areas you could move quite far quite quickly. But again, I don't know the game. So
shall we I'll keep going through a bunch of things so we can discuss them as we want. So I'll keep on flicking through a bunch of things. But what are some examples? Are there any examples that you really wanted to bring up before I do that?
So I quite enjoy... I've only actually played Game of Thrones once because it took so long to set up and do, and because it's 3+ players. So me and my husband, most of my gaming is me and my husband. So when we have someone else over, we can play something like Game of Thrones. Jaws came up on the list, which is one I quite enjoy, and obviously it's trying to remember whether it's more of a grid. I think it's more area movement. And there's Game of Thrones. And Small Worlds is one that a friend has that I get to play occasionally, which is really nice. So trying to look at the Game of Thrones map, and there's Small World, yeah. But
Josie mentions Mint Tin Delivery is point-to-point, and it's not in space, it's not the sea. And yeah, that's a fair point. It's kind of it feels a bit more abstract. I feel like point to point is good when you've got a limit on how many things can be on the point, because by its nature, these points are going to be smaller than an area, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I think if from one point you can go to 10 other points, it will look visually quite messy. Whereas if it's just a few, then it's not so bad.
I mean, Mint in Delivery, I think, is you go to about 3 different points at a time. But of course, we are talking about area movement. So let's flick through a few things. So here's Star Wars Rebellion. Here's War of the Ring, which is really interesting because it's got this big mountain, which is, I mean, I've not played this one, but I assume that mountain is impassable, that you can't go over unless you've got maybe certain units. Have you played War of the Ring?
I haven't. It looks quite cool. I want to.
Yeah, I know it. For lots of people, it's their favorite game. And in Eclipse, I've only played this once. It's one of those big, meaty games where, again, there's a question whether this is truly area movements or whether it's grid movements. Because, and you've got route here, which is mainly point to point, as you can see from the areas and in the lines. But then in between, you've got these forests, and the only time that the forests are actually used is from the Vagabond, which is interesting. Have you played this one?
I haven't. It's on my list that I really want to play. Someone's at the door. I'm going to ignore them. So I'm assuming the point-to-point lines then actually create the area movement areas.
Exactly, and that's really interesting.
I quite like that
And so the kind of slightly abstract things that you've got going on brings in this kind of more literal thing, because they are considered to be paths in the forest and you are going from clearing to clearing. Blood Rage, I just want to point out how cool the wee jagged lines look, because the whole thing, it's kind of got that heavy metal, you get to lots of possibilities for stylization where you make an area movement map. Would you agree?
Yeah, absolutely. I really like that.
Pax Pamir, very simple game, but on a cloth board, and there's a few areas moving pieces between. Mansions of Madness, I think this is the second edition. It's an interesting one because it's tile placement as you explore the house, but then each tile that you put down could be several bits, or it could be one bit. And so you're kind of creating this, I guess, again, it shows that by having smaller areas, you can build, denser things, have forests that have lots of areas, so you need to walk slowly through all the slivers. Keep going forward.
I like the idea, like you said before, about putting multiple areas on mountains means that it's harder to traverse the mountain, and it makes it, you don't have to say, oh, it takes X number of turns to go over a mountain. It just will do. I quite like that.
And it feels like the nice advantage of area movements. And here's Robinson Crusoe, as we discussed. It's kind of, is it grid movements or not?
Seems like grid movement's just a subcategory of area movement, and area movement does regular as well. So,
and it's interesting how in the book it is just, it's all just tessellation. You're putting things together some way, and then it goes into lots of other details. And again, I just want to acknowledge the vast difference between Board Game Geek and the book Building Blocks of Tabletop Game Design here, but it feels like area movement, by giving you a map, it feels the closest to reality, because we think of a map as a fairly realistic thing, right?
Yeah, so I guess whenever it's a grid, it's kind of an extra abstraction from feeling real. Hi, Alex. So yeah, it's just another level of abstraction to say, oh, well, these are going to be squares or hexes versus here's a bordered area.
And by having these kind of, I mean, it's not exactly realistic. It's still not a simulation of the energy you expend into walking or anything. But if you just need to say, okay, I put my piece down and then I move, there's nothing to say, oh, do I? And the point that they made, let's avoid corners, is such a strong point, because it made me realize that my own game, Drawn Together, is kind of analogous to area movement, because you, I mean, not really, but when you're coloring in 2 bits, they have to be contiguous. And so saying, oh yes, you can't have corners touching, it has to be actually adjacent, just having them laid out with smarter graphic design, that's something that I should have done, and that's something that I'm going to take on board for sure. I want to acknowledge
I wish I'd have thought of it with Playful Pets, actually, because Playful Pets is just a grid. And even if it was hexes rather than squares, I think with hexes you don't get that question of corners, because they are all touching, whereas that there is a certain amount of should you do diagonal movement. Although in it there is like a superpower to do diagonal movement, so you're essentially getting 2 movements in one, so it kind of makes sense on there. But I wish I'd have played around a bit with other maps to see what would work best rather than what just made sense at the time.
I think that the irregularity, which is the key feature here, is it gives you more control as a designer, and there's also more to consider. And whilst with a regular grid, sure, squares are the things that are most common for players, and especially non-gamers, hexes might be a little bit, oh, what's this? But as you say, there's never the question of, can I move diagonally or not? Which is a really strong feature. Have you ever seen those graphics of how far can I travel from here in 12 hours? It reminds me of that, where the terrain actually restricts movement, says Alex. I haven't. Have you, Nikita?
I haven't. Alex is going to have to tell us more.
Yeah, share a link. And hello, Yoda. It's lovely to see you.
Yoda.
I do want to acknowledge that probably a mixture of point-to-point and area, as we saw in Risk, and also Rising Sun is the thing that gives you most flexibility. But however you do it, it doesn't need to be something where the movement is a core part of the game. In El Grande or Battlestar Galactica, it's not a big feature of the game. It's just, hey, you go to a place and occasionally you're allowed to move cubes in El Grande. And in Battlestar Galactica, it's really about these things that you are, you know, what you're doing in the places. It's kind of like worker placements, except you have to move your worker in order to do the thing. So it's kind of giving you a little bit more restriction of what you can do next. And so, yeah, it feels like movement is such a big part of so many games, even when it's not the focus, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, especially if you're playing on a board, most of it is going to be moving around on the board, right? So obviously card games, not so much. Board games, movement of some kind makes sense.
Yeah, and like even with Huntic, like, which is a collectible cards game, there's this one-dimensional paper map in the middle, or I've seen sometimes you might even have a card. But then again, going back to area movements, and a quick hello to J Guards. Thank you for joining us. Again, I think parts of the beauty of area movements is that you get the potential for beautiful maps, and you get to illustrate lovely things. And looking at that city in Kemet, you can see that there's a wall which is its own area, so it's going to take you a little bit more to get in there. And so there's a bit of fortification, essentially, as a natural result of each space being one thing.
Yeah, I really like that. They've done a good job on making that look exciting. I wish I had a bigger screen right now.
So we talked about Game of Thrones, where I like this, where it's all stark white, and Small World again, white against. There's nothing too bright here except for the snowy mountains. But I want to acknowledge this. I'm really not a fan of this board. where it maybe it's just me, but those lines are just a bit faint, and I think this is kind of 101. You've got to make sure people can see the areas.
Yeah, I think especially against the sandy coloured background, you're going to end, there's a little bit of an accessibility issue, I think, if your site isn't brilliant.
Yeah, 100%. And then you've got merchants and marauders where, again, they've not used the stark white because they've tried to keep it on theme, but at least because of the plain blue background, it feels relatively easy to see all these areas. And so, yeah, that's all the examples that I had prepared. And Josie says a beautiful map on theme does help with being absorbed into the game. So how does it impact the game? How will it affect the experience at the table? Is it fundamentally a question about the aesthetics and a graphic design issue rather than a presentation issue rather than a game design issue in a sense?
I think it's both, really, isn't it? Because you have to have designed the right borders in the right places, and you have to make sure that there isn't. Thinking of when we played Game of Thrones, I'm sure there was a point where actually 3 of the regions do meet at a point, and we were trying to work out whether you could do that. And so that for me is good or bad game design, because if as a player, when you've got a competitive game and you're trying to plan your strategy, knowing whether that's going to be 1 or 2 movements is quite integral. So I think it is about good game design with it as well. Are you looking for it?
I'm just kind of having
there was a question of it at one point. I think it might have been
I can't see it right now.
No, I'll find it at some point.
But it's interesting because it feels kind of like Dixit, or indeed a game about wee whimsical creatures and trying to identify them after some mixed noises, or other games where the visuals and the game have to be designed concurrently. And it feels like, for sure, again, I'm aware that it's not area movement game, but just because the whole point about not meeting with corners, that's really influenced the way that I've thought about Drawn Together. And I'm going to redesign all of those maps. And I know that are fine as they are, but I'm going to improve that Heart versus Skull map and all the other maps, like just that little bit better. Maybe, yeah, we'll see how that goes. But it feels incredibly versatile. It feels like probably the most versatile by its nature, having irregular grids. And I mean, as soon as you've got, let's say you've got a hex-based map, maybe you say, okay, this one just here, I want it to be 3 hexes, or this one here, I want it to be 2 hexes. And you can do that. You can have special areas, not only areas which give you a special power or a special benefit for being there, but also areas which are just faster to move through. Like, hey, here's a river, and then this river sweeps you really quickly, so you can go there, and then you can go. And I don't know, maybe there's a picture of a speedboat on the river, and that would make perfect sense of it, right?
Yeah, I really like the fact that wouldn't, how you move wouldn't necessarily need to be 3 pages in the rulebook. It makes sense. As soon as you know how the grids or how the area movement is working and where the lines are, you just can go that way. And you know, if you're along the river, you can go to any point on there, which means you're moving quickly. I quite like that, as it is very, very versatile.
And Alex wants to say about the maps of how quickly could you get somewhere within a certain amount of time. This is from this area, you'd be able to get to this place within so many hours. I think that's what's going on. No, that No, I don't think that's it. Rail
But
Cambridge.
by what though? Is it by walking, by cycling,
I think it's by rail.
driving?
I think it's by rail.
Oh, I see.
And that doesn't seem right. That's because, you know, why are the islands kind of half in the thing? But
maybe Alex will tell us in a minute.
the next, so when would you use area movement rather than a regular grid? When is it worth having that irregularity?
I think on maps. I think when it's proper terrain you're going over, that's a really nice thing for it.
So would you say that when it's kind of abstract, you should just leave it abstract and it's only
no,
worth
not
being
necessarily, because that would depend on what your theme is and how you want people to move around on your map. But I think when it's really good is when you can see boundaries on a map and you're, you know, as the player, you understand that that's either a boundary between countries or because of certain terrain, and you don't even have to think about it. It just clicks and it's there, and it's just visually perfectly there. And I think that's when it's at its best. It doesn't mean it can't be used for other things, but I think that's when it's really good and works really well.
Yeah, I'm totally on board with you. I feel like when the background information, which again should be kind of in the background with the stark dividing lines more clear, you want to have them kind of make sense of the things. So the land masses kind of joining up, or okay, the reason for this being so difficult to get through is because it's a forest or something.
Yeah, and I really like the idea when there are very stark lines, if you are having a bit of colour issue. I know green-red is a problem. I imagine if the surrounding desert then leads into green, having a stark line there is quite useful. And that would just add more information for you. I'd hate to have to stare at a map for half an hour before we even start playing just to work out where all the different regions are.
Yeah, on this old copy of Risk, you can see how, yeah, especially in Europe, that's really hard to make out, right?
Yeah, I find that quite difficult. I think I would be face over the board in the middle of the table, just working out where the different areas are, especially once you've got a load of cubes there.
I mean, it's very pretty, but then when I compare it to Kemet with those really stark white lines, or, you know, I think just the modern aesthetic of just a crisp white line, it works really best.
Yeah, it does work really well. I don't think it detracts at all, because it's one of those things. And that's another thing with like grids and hexes, where it does detract a bit, because it does say these are perfect lines, which you don't get in the real world. The real world isn't made up of perfect lines. So having the little jagged lines in a small world and on certain maps, for me, is much more thematic.
Yeah, it makes it feel more naturalistic.
Yeah, absolutely.
And Alex says, yes, it's also good for colorblind players. And going back to Alex's previous map, yes, it was meant to show how long it takes to get from Cambridge station to any other station in the UK by rail.
From Cambridge.
I'm just, these bits in the aisles feel just, that doesn't feel like it can be true, surely. I mean, I'm just slightly in disbelief. It feels like a slightly simplified map.
Is there a rail bridge there?
Like, why is there such a big difference with the tip of the island down here? Yeah, I don't know. But Josie says, anyway, the modern designs are built on the shoulders of Risk's mistakes, absolutely. And I don't want to say, oh, Risk is a bad game or Monopoly is a bad game. Like, both of these games are brilliant for the time that they were conceived. And by the standards of like the 1930s, these are amazing games. And
also, I think as a game designer, having played those as a child and enjoyed them, because you're playing games with your family and you enjoy them, there's nothing you don't enjoy about it. But then as an adult, you come to it and you think, what would I have done different? And what will make it more fun for me now? And I think having played games like that when you were younger really, really helps with stuff like that.
And so the final question that I like to ask for these topics is, have we used it to any games, and would we? Now, whilst I mentioned Drawn Together, that's not like, and I can apply some of the lessons from this topic to that game. It's not an area movement. There's no movement in it. I mean, you can't really call your color spreading to be movements. It's not that at all. And so I haven't used it. I have in the past used a lot of actually point-to-point in Stomp bots, and I think that I've used a lot of grid-based, a lot of regular things. It feels like if I wanted to make another game, it feels like I would use it if I had the time to make a more naturalistic map, and if I were wanting to make it a bit more thematic and involve players a bit more. I feel like that's when I would use it. How about you, Nikita?
So for me, as I said, I've used grid movement, and having talked about it during this, I've realised actually it really, really makes sense for that game, especially because it's quite a small board. Having bigger just wouldn't work. The grid works, especially as you determine where certain things go based on rolling dice and where they intersect on the grid. So wouldn't really work with the more irregular shapes. But I do have a future game that I haven't actually talked about with anyone yet, except for one person at a convention, that I'm still deciding. It was originally going to be tile laying and movement, but I think I want it, because I've got the artwork in my head and it's going to be quite visually stunning. I would actually quite like to have it as irregular shapes, and having had this conversation, I think it's probably more going to go towards that now.
Awesome. So is that going to be your next thing?
So it's after Malum Hortus. Malum Hortus is on a little bit of a hiatus while I get myself.
Malum Hortus is of course your next thing, but is Irregular Shape Movements game going to be your next thing?
Yes. So it'll be the next big box game after that. So it's going to be quite a big map and quite a big game like Malum Hortus. But I do have other little games in between that will be coming out.
Cool. And I think when you talked about, it makes me realize that one thing we'd skipped over when we said, is it bad? Is that there's no denying that having irregularity is another thing to think about. If there is a regular grid, whether it's hexagons or squares or whatever, I mean, even pentagons, even though they're not the most regular thing, can be sort of at least that a consistency that once you're like, okay, this is it, I know I can move in these lines. But then if it's irregular shapes, then you've got to kind of compute. It's just another thing to think about, right?
Yeah.
And it depends with how much of a thing, how important the movement is to your game, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, so like I said, there are games where it just makes sense for it to be a grid because of how it's designed, and making it irregular might even make it look nicer visually in certain things, but wouldn't make sense for your game. I think some people want to play board games and they want to be 100% immersed, or as immersed as possible, so that kind of irregular shapes on a map is really nice. For other people, they just want to look at a board and see exactly what's going to happen. So like chess, for instance, if you know how all the pieces move, then you can look a few steps ahead, whereas you might not be able to do that as much. So I can't remember what game it was, so I'm going to sound a bit wishy-washy, but we had an argument where, well, it wasn't an argument, but on an irregular map, they're all kind of square and wiggly woggly, and then there was just like this kind of extra bit here, which meant that you could get to another area, and one person hadn't seen that, so they didn't realize you were going to get into their area on your next turn. So, and obviously that's the first play of a game when you haven't realized that, and once you've played a few times, you'll know. But that caused a little bit of kind of, but obviously I know that you can go down there. It might have been a river or something like that.
One of the big things in Kingmaker, which I had a very small part in, because something that I said actually caused Alan to change the map, which was, hey. But parts of it was Alan trying to make it clear which things were connected and which weren't. Because in the original game, I think that whatever system you've got, there's, unless you're really careful, you're going to be confused. And, well, some players are going to be confused, I should say. And you want to ideally avoid those thin slivers that come up awkwardly.
Yeah.
And Alex says irregular shaped chess would be interesting, but then the problem with that is that I think that the regularity of the grid is what allows you to then have pieces that you couldn't really replicate a knight's movements where it moves.
Yeah, you can't do an L shape on irregular pieces.
Yeah. I mean, I think that you need regularity in order to have pieces which move in weird ways that match the grid, because otherwise the irregularity is going to end up with a lot of weird edge cases and then suddenly 20 pages of rules that explain what's going on.
Might just do a chessboard, just it's still a grid but just wobbly lines.
I mean, Alex, sure, if you make it totally different, I mean, maybe that's your starting point, but I'm just saying that at a certain point, it's not chess anymore. It's a different game which is inspired by that, and that's no bad thing. I mean, go and make that game, but just want to acknowledge that it's not really, but chess. But yeah, I think that it's at this point, is there anything else that we would like to say about this topic, or have we actually covered it all?
I don't think we've covered all of it. You have to go a long, long way for that.
But I feel like I've learned a little bit. My main takeaway is that even though it's listed as a mechanism on Board Game Geek, it's one of those cases where it's about the blurry line between mechanisms, as in affordances and like what you're able to do, and the rules of the game, but also the visual presentation. Because the visual presentation is what gives you the information of what you're able to do. And this is one of those cases where, yeah, the two are really intertwined. That's my main takeaway. What would you say is your main takeaway?
I think it's nice that I hadn't really thought about it deeply, as well as reading the Board Game Geek description of it. I entirely thought we'd be talking about grid movement as well, because it says regular and irregular, and I do think grid movement is just already encapsulated in that, so I don't know why it's a separate thing as well. But it's something that I've played a lot of games. Scrolled through the list, I've played a lot of games with irregular movement and never really thought about it, because it just makes sense at the time, and I really quite like that. And there's no, you have to be within a square, and this is adjacency, and this is diagonal, and you have to do all of those things. I really like how it can help a game, or how a game designer can put out exactly what they want people to see and what they want people to get from it. And mostly what I've gotten from it is that, you know, in a few years I'll be making a game with one, hopefully, with it.
And I think that I would almost say that this should be really is divided into irregularly shaped areas. That's what it should be. If I was allowed to edit this, which maybe I am, I would say the board is divided into, that's how I would put it. And I'll write a note to the admin, and I'm actually going to submit that after this thing. Right. Because, I mean, that feels like a much more accurate thing. Because, regular and repeating are grid movements, and grid movements already exists. So this should be explicitly excluding chess and it It should be excluding grid movements, which is a separate category, because otherwise, why have them both?
Yeah, I didn't know grid movement was also a category, and it doesn't make sense for them both to be there if area movement is.
No,
Alex, that's what I said at the beginning.
It's like if we look at the area movements, look at the games which have number rating, so like chess should be like there's nothing number ratings. Like suddenly now we've got Forbidden Islands and Takenoko. Like this is for grid. This is the grid movements page. So all of these are based on grid movement, where yes, it makes sense. Gots and the chess with how many ratings?
See, I was all ready to talk about Jaws of the Lion because that's what I'm playing at the moment.
And Jaws of the Lion is
probably not on there. Gloomhaven's number 2, but
Gloomhaven. How many there we go. So Gloomhaven 22. That's in grid movement. 22,000. But you can see that it's not an area movement, which makes sense if you're dividing them, in which case this should be edited. So, I mean, are we agreed that this is a fine edit?
Yeah, I would put in the edit summary that the reason you're changing it is because grid movement is a separate thing.
Mansions of Madness is not regular, because as we said, Mansions of Madness is very irregular. I mean, look at that. I mean, these are not regular shapes.
They're irregular shapes on regular tiles, aren't they? So
they are weird. I mean, the actuals. It's very important that you're not moving from bit to bit. But anyway, I think that
I do like that idea though of regular shaped tiles, so that's still a tile laying game with irregular shapes inside it. I quite like that.
Yeah, I almost feel like we should have more of that. But anyway, let's close up because I did say that we were going to try and aim for 40 minutes. But it's been a lovely chat, and hopefully have you back again for another one. Maybe try and have you back for some more of the movement things, so you can actually compare and contrast a little bit. But do you have a question for everyone who's been watching, a question for me potentially, a question that you can pose to all of us for the question of the day? Question of the day. It's a little question before we go on our way. Question of the day.
Well, I want to ask a question. I bet your regular viewers actually know the answer, but it'd be great to get all of their answers. Do you see on Twitter when people say wrong answers only?
Oh, yeah.
I really like that. So my question is, why is red Bez's signature colour?
Wrong answers only.
Wrong answers only from everyone else, and then a correct answer from you.
Okay.
Incidentally, I did dye my hair yesterday just for you.
I was going to say before we started, oh, your hair is really beautiful and like vibrant.
I hadn't dyed it in months, and then I thought, well, I'm going to be on Bez's show, and I've got the box here, so I best do it. Hi, Hexie.
Morning. And Alex says, wrong answer. It's her favourite colour. How do you know that's the wrong answer? It's anger. I've never known someone so stressed. I love that answer because it embodies my rage and how I want to murder everyone around me. That sounds actually really threatening. Please don't clip that. Yes, eclipses in area movements. Again, it is it's a minority, and I think that it would make more sense subcategories, given that both exist. If it's a subcategory, then all the grid movements should be in there. If it's separate, which I think it should be, then they should be clearly separate from the description. I don't know why you're so intent on saying that, on providing small counterexamples, when we all know that Board Game Geek has lots of things incorrectly defined. Sometimes
Yeah,
even
and
by
they
the...
tend to just be defined by people and edited by people all the time. It's a bit Wikipedia in some places.
Yeah,
Whatever
absolutely.
someone has done. I mean, for me, whenever I put a new game on there, I scroll through every single mechanic and I go, yeah, it's got a bit of that. Yeah, it's got a bit of that.
And honestly, there's been a couple of places where I've looked back as the course of doing this series, I've realized, wait a minute, I actually got that wrong for my own game. And so I might have miscategorized my own games. And yeah, most people aren't going to spend the time to get to know all of these things before they start categorizing stuff. They're just like, oh yeah, area movement, yeah, that sounds right, and click there. I think that's how it generally goes. But and Alex, if you think it shouldn't be limited exclusively to regular shapes, then what's the point of having grid movements? And at that point, you're basically arguing that all of the grid movement things should be essentially also in area movement.
I mean, that would genuinely be my argument. I think there just shouldn't be a grid movement section. It's all area movement. You're moving from one area to another area.
Which is maybe the correct answer, but again, given how many games there are, given that there's 7,000 grid movements and almost 5,000 area movements, I think it's worth keeping them apart, especially when there's some mechanisms that just have a couple hundred things in them. And so I think rather than being, oh, it's only 5,000 and 7,000, let's put them together to make 12,000 games.
There's probably a lot of crossover, though. 3,000 of them are probably the same on both.
Yeah, true. But it's still a lot
of crossover. I think there's so many mechanics. Maybe we should find some that can be combined.
I don't know, because I feel like the differentiation is really useful, because isn't there times when you're like, I want to have a nice area movement? Let's say you're on Board Game Geek and you're like, you know what, I really like area movement games and I want to click to find similar things. That's ultimately what it's meant to be for, from a user perspective, or from a researcher perspective. It's, oh, I wonder what other things exist like this. So, and yeah, Mansions of Madness 2nd edition is absolutely irregular because it's not quite on the grid. But the truth of the red is it was a bright color. It's a color that I believe that people will see visibly. I mean, it's not the brightest day, but if I turn the lights on, you can. I mean, the red stands out against most things. And after I went to UK Games Expo 2015 to hand out In a Bind, then people were like, oh, I heard there was someone wearing red, and oh, you said you'd be wearing red, so we'd find you, but you're wearing a lot of red, even though I was only wearing 3 red things. So also like that much. But now I've got to the point where all the shoes I buy are red, and basically like all the things. So if I'm out, I will try to be like literally from my toe to here. And I don't know if I'll dye my hair again for Essen. I'm considering it, but I don't know. It's a sort of an expense, and I cannot go in, guys. I don't know. But anyway, but it's just become a thing. So that's the truth. It's so that I'm visible. At this point, oh, sorry.
No, I like it. It's good reasoning.
Over to you. What are you up to? You can share button if you want to. I am going to have Stephen, who helps me out at TerraCon, come over, and then we're hopefully going to do a whole bunch of things together, a bunch of postage, anything that people have ordered in the past 7-ish days, and send out stuff. That's the bulk of what I've got to do. Also sort out Dragon Meat stuff that I didn't sort out yesterday. I did actually sort out the UK Games Expo orders. I've already put in my booking for UK Games Expo. I don't know if you saw that email for the exhibitors. It said, would you like a stand? Let us know. And
no, I'll go do that now. That'll be my
So, I mean, as long as you do it by the end of October, you'll be fine. But I just wanted my specific spot that I've had in 2019. I had the spot. 2018, I think, also had a spot. 2020, like, let's not talk about 2020.
Well, they're good at that because previous email I'd seen from them said if you want the same space again, then you're more likely to get it. And I loved where I was this year.
Yeah, I mean, if you specifically want it, they do try to accommodate people, and they do try to make it easy. So I think that if you ask for the same spot, then they'll say, yeah, sure. And I said, hey, can I get the same spot, but make it 2 meters longer? And because I figured that if we hadn't had the people beside us basically not there, we would have had to crawl around our table. So we definitely needed at least 1 more meter than we actually had. And I figure I can afford, it's like the last year I'll be in the UK. I'm going to splash out a little bit. So I'll be back, I'll be back sometimes. And you'll see me online or whatever. It's not like
I mostly see you online, to be fair, so it's probably fine.
But yeah. And Josie says, hello, say hello to Stephen from me. I will do it. Wow, I'm tempted to get an exhibitor booth just to run it as a place to sit down.
You know what? I had the smallest booth you can get, 2 meters by 2 meters, and I had so many friends come up to me and say, "I've bought all of this. Can I put it under your table?" So half of the stuff under my table was other people's stock at certain points. But we did have a few demos that were just people saying, "I'm really tired," and I was like, "Do you want to sit down and have a demo?" Yeah.
I think that's a really good thing to be able to have, because if you've got a colouring in contest or something where people can sit down and play something that's not real time and it's not super stressful, then it's like, yeah, I'm a bit fatigued, I just need a moment. And so it can be really nice to just have something where, okay, you can learn this or you can do this. And Drawn Together was so good. I was really proud of how much people were enjoying that at Tabletop Scotland. And so I had people colouring in on the edge of a table basically all weekend, because you could just say, do this, and then leave them to it for half an hour while they got on with it.
Yeah, that's really great.
I want to acknowledge the open gaming area was pretty packed, to be fair. And I do like Alex's point that it's not so much about the visual representation, but it's about how movement is determined. Grid movement involves a direction aspect, and area movement doesn't. Counterexample, Hive? No, that involves directions for the grasshoppers. Yeah, I would agree with that. Would you agree with this?
Yeah, it does make sense. Sorry, I had to read it twice.
So like grid movement, it's like kind of, you need to continue moving in a same direction, but area movement, it's kind of, you are moving space to space. I'm actually going to look at the grid movement
I've played
things.
grid games where you might go up and down and right and around.
Yeah, now I'm thinking like Hive, Gloomhaven, Forbidden Island, well, yeah, the top 3 are all counterexamples now. I mean, yeah, it's been a while since I played Takenoko.
Yeah, I mean, so I haven't played Gloomhaven, but I'm playing Jaws of the Lion, and you don't necessarily keep going in one direction. You go up here, you fight someone, you move back down, and you go wherever you want, whenever you need, whichever way you need.
Yeah, it feels like grid movements has the possibility for directional something that matters directionally. And yeah, because it's only with regular grids that you can involve direction, but with irregular grids you can't. But then it doesn't mean that you have to have that necessarily. And yeah, look, just to clarify, there's a lot of mechanisms in any game. There's no game that's just one single mechanism. Well, I'm sure there's a counterexample to that. But if we look up Hive, was it further up? If we look up Hive, then it mentions enclosure, grid movement, hexagon grid, pieces as map, score and reset games, slide push, 3-dimensional movements, and tile placement. So it's got all of these things going on. because games are not just one thing. Games are a mixture of things, and that's the most important thing. And yeah, so anyway, if there's anything else that anyone else wants to share, then feel free to go ahead. Otherwise, to recap and wrap up before we finish up, talked about organization. We talked about gearing up for Christmas sales. Talked about first sales on your things. Congratulations. And unfortunately, Kat's being unwell, but hey, hooray for medicine. Like, modern medicine is brilliant with all the vitamins and nutrients and like the arm implants and all that stuff. I mean, you're basically a cyborg at this point. We, I know that's a bit of an exaggeration.
That's what I'm going with it.
We showed a whole bunch of examples. We talked about how area movement, it's the graphic design tells us what to do, and this is all about graphical design representation. It allows us to have something more realistic and that feels more naturalistic, like maps. And we talked about the difference between area movements and grid movements, and then we basically finished up, and we had a lovely ramble. It's been a delight. And if you want to check me out, I am Stuff by Bez in all the places. Feel free to share, spread the word. Thank you very much, everyone. And it's stuffbybez.com/streams. But again, thank you very much to everyone, including, of course, Nikita Sullivan. Thank you so much for being here. And if people would like to check you out, where would you like people to go to check you out?
There's my website. @kinggames.com. I'm also @kinggames on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And if you want to message me for any reason, Twitter is best.
Awesome. So once more, thank you so much, everyone. I have to rush off, and lots of love. It's been an absolute delight. And bye, 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 bye. This is a goodbye song to do. Bye, 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 bye. Thank you for watching along. Bye, 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 bye. This is the end of the show. Bye, 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 bye. And now it's time to go. Bye, 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 bye. This is a goodbye song. Bye, 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 bye. Thank you for watching along. Bye, 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 bye. This is the end of the show. Bye, 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 bye. And now it's time to go. Bye, bye, everyone.